Odd Conduit Media.
The Sandman Unlocked.
Hello, dreamers, and welcome to another episode of The Sandman Unlocked. I'm one of your co-hosts, Ashley, and I am thrilled you're joining us for our breakdown of the Sandman Issue 6, 24 Hours. I am joined by two sins against God, all meringue and razor blades, Sean.
Hey, what's up?
And surprise guest, Pat.
Say what now?
Our producer.
Surprise! I'm usually the producer. I'm on the podcast today. I graduated. Ben, I'm not coming after your job. I promise.
There's like an early 2000s like rap song, and it was like one of Kanye's first verses, and then like Dame Dash was on the track, and he was just like talking over it. And he was just, I remember him being like, we got the producer on the record. He raps better than most rappers. And it feels appropriate to say here.
Well, here we are. I definitely rap better than my brother, but we'll see if I Sandman unlocked better than my brother.
See if he can get Sandy.
Let's get Sandy.
Let's see how Sandy you can get, Pat. All right. On each episode, we'll be deconstructing the issue in 6 separate sections. First will be the rundown, where we let you know who created the issue, and then we'll go to the catch-up to be sure you know where we are in the story. Next, we'll do the breakdown. This gives you a synopsis of the week's issue, and we follow that up with the deep dive when we really get into everything that happened. Then in our last 2 sections, we'll discuss our favorite panel, sometimes occasionally more than one, and our favorite non-Morpheus character.
So there you have it. 6 sections to get through, so let's get going. Pat, over to you for the rundown.
All right. Well, before we get to the rundown, I think our waiter's coming over. Just let me put in my order real quick. Okay, so this week, issue 6, we have the usual Neil Gaiman as the writer. For penciler, we have Mike Drigenberg. The cover was done by Dave McKean. The inker is Malcolm Jones III. The colorist is Robbie Bush. The letterer is Todd Klein, and the editor is Karen Berger. Sean, why don't you catch us up on what's been going on so far?
Okay, so he was so close, wasn't he, folks? After spending 70 years locked up in Roderick Burgess's basement and barely escaping, only to find his tools have been stolen, and his realm has decayed. Morpheus, the Lord of Dreams, was almost back on top. He'd found his pouch of sand with the help of John Constantine, bluffed the hordes of hell, and bested the devil himself to reclaim his helm, and then finally tracked down his ruby, his dreamstone, the embodiment of his power, with a little help from some weirdo superheroes. And just when he goes to grab the thing, it freaks out and knocks him unconscious. See, the thing is, the ruby had been altered and manipulated by the psychotic John Dee, who spent years locked up after using the ruby to commit a bunch of silly Silver Age crimes. But John has taken a darker turn during his time locked away. He escapes and goes to track down the ruby, brutally murdering a woman who had given him a ride and shown him nothing but kindness. He arrives at the warehouse location of the ruby mere moments after the Sandman, stepping over his unconscious body to reclaim what he believes is rightfully his. When we last see Dr. D, he enters a nondescript small-town diner to finally put his nefarious plans into action. And over to you for the breakdown, Ashley.
Thank you, Sean. We are introduced to the all-night diner, where we meet Bet and her customers, or shall I say, raw material, Judy, a young man with an interview at the chemical works, Gary and Kate Fletcher, Marsh, and a quiet little stranger in a corner seat, our beloved Dr. D. At first, he appears to merely be observing them, as Bet does for her stories, until one of them attempts to leave. This is when we begin to see Dee's true motive, to let his precious ruby keep the flies in the trap, driving them slowly to madness for his own entertainment. He experiences their desires and dramas, provokes violent conflicts, and makes himself a god among them. By hour 11, it becomes abundantly clear how widespread the effects of the ruby are. Both instantaneous comatose states and insomnia plague the world, provoking global insanity. Then D receives a visit from the three, the kindly ones, and demands them to tell him his future. Despite all past etiquette, they offer three, each more true than he realizes. After he has 3, 2, 1. After he has dined on their depravity, both coerced and supplied willingly, he tells them a fairy tale and permits them to finish killing one another, and then sits, for the first time in 24 hours, alone, and waiting for the Dream Lord. When Dream appears, Dr. D greets him with pride as Dream surveys the wreckage. End scene.
All right, let's get into the deep dive. But hold on, I think the waiter's coming over to take our order. Let's just take a second to... Wait, didn't we already... I'm confused. I'll be right back.
Ben and Ava had the perfect life.
Do you want me to drive?
No, I'll be all right. I'm not due for another month.
Until they had a tragic accident. Now they're on a road trip to reconnect.
It's been 5 months.
They stop at a bed and breakfast owned by Martha and Dennis Newman.
Oh, well, hello there. Dennis, we've got guests.
Martha, where's supper?
Who have no intentions of letting them leave.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, sounds like someone fell.
Gotcha!
What do you want with us? Why are you doing this? This is about something much bigger.
It's about family.
You have to run! They're catching up!
Stay the night. 11 episodes that will keep you on the edge of your seat.
And we're back. We're diving straight into the meat of the episodes where our co-hosts lend their expertise. Sean, why don't you kick it off for us today? What do you got?
All right, well, let's talk about some of the changes in this issue. I mean, this is a big break from the previous ones that we've encountered. Neil Gaiman identifies this issue as, quote, the first time I tried to break all the rules of what had been done in comics to date, to go as far as I could go. A lot of readers said they stopped buying Sandman after issue 6 and didn't come back for ages until they were told it was safe.
No way.
Yes.
No way. I believe it. I mean, I believe it.
Yeah, it's pretty understandable, right? Because this issue is mean, it's ugly, and it's pretty brutal. In our TV watch-alongs episodes, Ashley and I have both talked about how much we miss the sort of like rough, grimy edges of these early issues compared to the kind of very smooth and silky Netflix adaptation. Well, in this issue, we got as much as we could handle and then some. So, if you're coming from the TV show or really any of Gaiman's other work, this probably comes as somewhat of a shock. Even if you come from the previous issue where Dream rides a dragon and a bus and meets a Martian. I don't know if you read that issue, Pat, but all those things happen.
Definitely.
This was probably an experience you were not expecting. But that's the effect Gaiman was going for.
Yeah, I certainly, first time reading the comics, I read this issue a few days ago, and it was shocking. I loved it. I loved every moment. And it just keeps getting pushed further. It just keeps getting pushed further. There are some fantastical things in the previous issues, but dang, he really pushes the limits here. And I love that he's outspoken about trying to break all the rules here.
Yeah, and like one of the notable differences, like you called out, is that there's no established like DC guest stars in this issue. No new ones anyway. We've seen, Dr. D before. And that's kind of a balance that he was trying to strike. So he says, I was walking a tightrope, really. I wanted the series to look enough like a superhero comic to get people who liked superheroes to read it, And I wanted it to look enough like a horror comic to allow me to write the sort of fantasy stories I was interested in writing. So he's really kind of balancing all these different popular genres at the time and trying to draw in, as many readers as possible. He wants to be able to continue telling this story. And especially in these first several issues, it's kind of, I think it all works really well together, but it's all over the place in terms of the tone and things like that. He's identified it as being essentially 5-finger exercises, he says, to help me find out what my voice sounds like. That's why I titled the book collecting these stories Preludes and Nocturnes. They're preludes to my figuring out my approach to the series. So Gaiman and his crew, they're feeling experimental, bold, and they're trying to keep readers from getting too comfortable while still giving them away into the series. In an Entertainment Weekly interview from 2017, he says, "Whenever people would criticize me because characters who they liked died in Sandman, I would point out to them that pretty much everybody dies in Sandman. It's set out there that if you keep a story going long enough, it will end in death." And that's something that's written out, in this book. And he says everybody's going to get it. And that, I felt, that being, this issue, was where that was established. I got to push that pin in 24 hours. This was a big turning point in the series. Now, the story itself was inspired by Peter Greenaway's 1988 film, Drowning by Numbers. Have any of you ever seen that?
No.
I've never seen that. No, I've never even heard of it, but I'm going to check it out now if this is based on that.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either, because it's kind of hard to get a hold of his films, but they are absolutely stunning and horrifying and funny. His movie The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover is one of the most beautifully designed and shot movies I've ever seen, and it's got cannibalism.
Nice.
As one does.
Yes.
Naturally.
Yeah, but he was trained as a classical artist, so all of his compositions look like paintings. It's absolutely gorgeous. But Drowning by Numbers basically counts 1 through 100 over the course of a story about 3 women who drown their husbands. And this is what makes Neil go, hey, I've got 24 pages. I'll do an hour a page.
Okay.
Because that was sort of the original conceit. 24 pages, 24 hours.
That's brilliant.
But of course, he had to kind of give up on that a little bit when he realized that the first pages had to be devoted to introducing the characters properly.
Sure.
And so, before I found him actually talking about this, I had I figured that was what happened, because it almost aligns page for page, each hour as a page, but the first hour takes up 5 pages or something like that. Some other ones are compressed to half a page each. But I was I know there's a draft out there somewhere where he's trying to write it as 1 page each hour.
Imagine trying to fit that in. And I wonder at what point he was okay, it's not possible, Neil. We have to move on.
Yeah, I'm wondering what he cut to be able to make what we have now. If he had some terrible thing happening per hour.
Do we have
didn't make
access to those drafts? Is there a Sandman museum out there or online that we could see some of the early drafts? Do you know, Sean?
I don't know. He's probably published more because he writes full scripts. He's probably published more of his scripts than other writers I can think of. I don't know if the current edition does, but the original collected edition of Dream Country, the 3rd volume, had a full script written out in it just for people to see
cool.
how he does it.
That's incredible.
Yeah, but I don't know if there's archives for comic creators are really hard to find and track down because so much of it in the early days was thought of as like disposable, you know,
Right.
and so much of it was made as work for hire, owned by someone else. So, you know, you might not even have access to your original drawings after you've turned them in.
Right.
But hopefully someday there's a Neil Gaiman archive publicly available. But I digress.
So,
So this, you know, given this more experimental goal, but still sort of, you know, working within the confines of what would be an effective comic book story, he kind of says to himself, you know, hang on, I'll stay in one location, right? And awful things are going to happen in this one location over 24 hours. And he says, it came into focus suddenly and beautifully. I knew what had to happen in each hour, and I just brought a bunch of people onto the stage and destroyed them. And it was an awful thing. It was like, okay, where does my imagination go? What would I do to these people? And then going, this needs to be relentless. It needs to be horrible. And it can never be torture porn. You can never enjoy what is happening to these people, which I thought is a noble goal. It's a tough needle to thread, right?
Yes.
I feel like this issue is this really bold challenge to both the creators of the books themselves and the audience. It's the clearest break so far from anything Neil was doing in the previous issues and really anything in mainstream comics at the time. Although, like, Jamie Delano and John Ridgway had some pretty horrifying stuff happening in Hellblazer, and Alan Moore and Stephen Bissette did do like a 20-page sex scene between a woman and a plant monster in Swamp Thing. But, you know, aside from those, this is pretty unique. You know, you get what I'm saying. So I just want to share some last words from Neil on this topic. He says, one of the reasons I wrote that issue was to say, look, this narrative will not always be trustworthy. It will not always be kind. People will not always get out alive. Bad things can happen. What was nice is I never had to go that dark again. The readers always knew that I had, and always knew that I was capable of it, and that things could get dark.
I love it. So he's kind of peaking with his darkness here. He's pushing everybody's limits, and then he kind of takes a step back, and he doesn't have to go back there for the rest of the series. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I do find that an interesting comment, though, that I never have to go that dark again. Maybe he doesn't do so for this length of an issue, but I would argue there are some moments that are as dark. They're just fleeting.
Yeah.
Especially for women.
Yeah, like Calliope, right? Like,
yeah.
parts of that are, I would say.
And Eurydice.
Yeah.
Like, not fun, not great, kind of monstrous.
But they're fleeting, as you said, and they're not entire issues dedicated to getting to know characters just to watch them be tortured, right? That's really interesting. I like it. What do you have for today, Ashley?
Yeah, so focusing still on the diner a little bit, my two deep dives are, as we said just moments ago, far more fleeting and less overarching like Sean's are in this particular episode. But there were two specific things that I kind of just caught while reading this time around. The first one that I want to focus on are the occurrences of sheep throughout the issue.
Yeah. I never noticed that before this reading.
Yes, exactly. Same, actually. So when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to focus on, the imagery of sheep came up frequently. And I looked like Charlie from It's Always Sunny because I was itemizing all of the moments in which sheep popped up in a panel. And I have a list of them in front of me. The first one being when Bet is talking about being a writer, and it's like right above, it might be a door or a fridge or some like cabinetry, I'm not sure which. And then above the mirror when so it like kind of moves. It doesn't stay in one place, which I found really compelling. I was trying to figure out, okay, where's the location of this picture of a sheep? Why would they choose to put this in a diner? But it's never in the same place. It's always moving and always with different characters as you go on, because you also see it with Judy when she's by the phone when she's going to call Donna. You see it by the Fletchers when they're, talking to Bet, making their order. You see it with the guy who's on his way to an interview and he's ordering more coffee to see with Marsh. So it always occurs at least in the same panel once with each character, which I find interesting because you see Dr. D then later refer to the his victims in the diner as insects the whole time, as flies, as insects. But then you see the sheep imagery, and ultimately you get this general theme of D referring, not outwardly, explicitly referring to himself as a predator, but he thinks of himself as such. He thinks of himself as having more control than he does, really, because he thinks of himself as having captured these people and brought them into his web, into this trap. And simultaneously with the sheep imagery, you think of them as also having been herded into this enclosure and then being put through their paces as one would, a herding dog would herd sheep through various obstacles. And you do. He puts them through their paces, but at the same time, the reader knows the power of the ruby and how much the ruby is probably having that effect on him as well, which I find a really interesting sort of comparison.
Like his whole desiccated appearance comes from,
yes,
being denied access to the dream world.
Right, exactly. So you also see this comparison with sheep and wolves because later, when the television is going through various programming, when it goes to the sort of National Geographic type programming and they're all acting like wolves, then you also have the whole description of how wolves are pack animals and how they function together in their own society.
Yeah, that little bit of that little sound clip coming from the TV was from the Wolfman, the 1941 Wolfman.
That's right. That's why it sounded familiar to me. Okay, thank you.
And that's, again,
thank you.
Sheep and wolves,
Yeah, well, and it's, with this sort of out-of-body narrator we have throughout the entire issue as well, it's just interesting how their behavior is described very animalistic.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, Dr. D thinks of himself as kind of, a wolf in sheep's clothing, but really he's a sheep in wolf's clothing. He's putting on airs, he's putting on, he assumes more power than he actually has. Even in the effects of the way he tries to use the ruby, he doesn't have an original thought in his head because the global effects are very similar to the global effects that Dream's powers had in the very beginning of the series. Right. Total global encephalitis lethargica, also insomnia, paranoia, and all the insanity.
Which, if you haven't heard our first couple episodes, have historical precedent.
They do.
Very interesting.
They do.
Go back and listen if you haven't heard.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I also kind of find the comparison between Dr. D and Bet interesting as well, because in the beginning of this issue, we have Bet referring to her client, or these patrons of this diner as being her raw material. So she's using them and she's kind of preying on their lives, certainly without consent, because she's writing about them and just changing the ending of those stories. So, I know we already talked about the TV episode, the last podcast episode, but I like that they picked up on that for the TV episode, that we've got Bet who's using the clientele for their stories. She's kind of farming them. And then Dr. D is farming everyone in this diner for his own enjoyment, which I find a really interesting sort of hierarchy where everyone assumes more power than they have. Everyone assumes more control than they have. Even when they're under the effects of Dr. D using the ruby, they're thinking of themselves as at times willingly doing this thing or not realizing they're under somebody else's control until he gives them their sanity back for a brief second and then goes back to kind of puppeting them around.
That's really interesting because another sort of Gaiman quote that I didn't end up including in my little thing there was where he says that this issue was the first one he realized he was writing a story about stories. And in part it comes from, that experience of writing Bet's character. So there's this interesting moment of like self-reflexivity where he's got D torturing these characters, but he's making all of this happen, right? He's doing all this to the characters and the readers, and sort of, so he's sort of the I feel like the role of the writer is really part of the conflict of this issue.
Well, and it has to be. And I think that's really apparent even as you start this issue, because we suddenly have this narrator we've never met before, and we can't quite place ownership of that voice. I don't know, Sean, if you have thoughts on that specifically at all, but as they're describing Bet's actions, I'm like, oh, okay, this is the first time I read this, I thought, oh, this is Dr. D narrating all of these lives of these people here. And then we get to Dr. D, and the narrator's narrating his decisions and inner monologue, and I'm like, wait a minute, so wait, who's talking? Is it the Ruby? Who is this? And it's really off-putting. It's really unsettling.
We don't really have much in the way of... Okay, I guess like the first issue also has that sort of omniscient narrative voice, but we haven't really seen it since then, have we? This is the first time it's propped back up.
Yeah, you're right, because it's usually like Dream talking about it. I like to read this issue in David Attenborough's voice.
That's pretty good, yeah.
Right? Neil Gaiman
I
playing David Attenborough.
I kind of love that. And that's now all I'm going to be able to hear whenever I do subsequent rereads. But I do find it kind of compelling that there is this narrator anytime the concept of power is introduced, because it's kind of reminding you that everyone that's present really doesn't have nearly as much control as they think they do. You know, they sort of exude in their own sort of ecosystem a modicum of control, but it doesn't really exceed beyond what they imagine it does. And just generally for the world building that Dream inhabits with regard to him not being a god, but being godlike, having these powers and having this control over his own domain and such. We've seen Neil Gaiman in so many of his works have discussions about godlike power and what makes one godlike as opposed to a god, and what kind of responsibilities come with that kind of power. So you also see Dr. D sort of functioning as this sort of false prophet with regard to the tools he's using and how it's representative of the dreaming, and how he sort of upsets the balance of that rule that Dream has. So that's where you would get into, say, my territory with regard to biblical scholarship, because you have a lot of both Hebrew scripture and in the Gospels references to false prophets being compared to wolves in sheep's clothing, to being packs of ravenous wolves tearing apart the helpless, the victims, those who are completely unable to defend themselves. So I do find that, again, to be an interesting sort of comparison or parallel, not because Neil Gaiman is attempting to create some sort of sermon illustration. I don't think he would ever do that, but specifically because the idea of honesty, the idea of responsible wielding of power and leadership is kind of a moral exemplar in a lot of the heroes of Neil Gaiman's work. So being able to pull from those threads, I think, is a natural sort of illusion for him.
Definitely. And the sheep imagery in the Bible is also very present.
Oh, absolutely. Because they're generally innocent as doves.
Yeah.
Followers are wanting to be like sheep,
Right.
not so much that they're mindless, but because they're obedient.
Exactly.
Because they go where they're meant to go.
Exactly.
And even the one that does stray away is valued, because, again, livestock was valued.
Sure.
And you don't want to be like a goat, because goats do their own thing.
Right.
thing. But there's community in numbers, that all of that. There's lots of illustrations of sheep being good, but in this case, they're bad because they're helpless. So again, bringing out that power imagery and that discussion of what does power look like, what does absolute power look like, how does one wield it, and is it a good thing to be innocent and vulnerable, or in this case, is it more important to be shrewd and powerful?
Well, I think that the idea of the sheep in a biblical sense, especially the New Testament, is that the Lord is your shepherd. You can be a sheep as long as you have the Lord as your shepherd, but if you don't have Jesus on your side and it's just John D. in the diner messing with you, then it's not a great time to be a sheep.
No, well, and not even just Christ. Again, in the Old Testament, it's referenced Yahweh is meant to be this eternal sort of shepherd. And so that's why when there were false prophets, specifically if you pull out Ezekiel, which is like one of the most metal books of the Bible. If you're
Ooh,
ever really wanting a good time, read the prophet Ezekiel. It
Cool.
is so very sad and hardcore, but very, very good. He's describing the kingdom of Babylon, which were their ultimate enemies, enslaved. And when we think of the enslavement of the Jews, we think Egypt. Babylon is a big part of that as well. And so you have Ezekiel 5 years after their enslavement. He's living in a tent city, receives this vision, and it has to do with, the Lord, Yahweh, expressing to him, hey, Israel has strayed. They've taken on false gods. They've also started listening to false prophets. There are false prophets among you. What's the line? Let me pull it up real quick. Here it is. Ezekiel 22, verses 26 through 28. Its priests have done violence to my teaching and have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the common being the profane. Neither have they taught the difference between the unclean and the clean, and they have disregarded my Sabbath, so that I am profaned among them. Its officials within it are like wolves tearing the prey, shedding blood, destroying lives to get dishonest gain. Its prophets have smeared whitewash on their behalf, seeing false visions and divining lies for them, saying, "Thus says the Lord God," when the Lord God has not spoken. So we see that a lot from D, in that he is, again, he's expressing, and we see that in that panel too, that series of panels where they have like God written in blood across his chest, and he's even talking about how, he takes the sacrifice even though he doesn't want it. He doesn't even really know what would satiate him.
Yeah, definitely.
So he's definitely playing at this godlike power. And going back to my discussion about Hermetic philosophy, he is trying to take over a domain that's not his. He doesn't even really know the extent of that domain in the first place. So he's kind of play acting here, and doing so on a small scale, just to see what satisfies him, which so far we've seen is really not much at all.
No.
Yeah.
He doesn't even know what he's hungry for.
Yeah. He's just kind of pushing the boundaries, much like Neil Gaiman pushed the boundaries when he wrote this issue, as Sean brought up earlier.
It's because I think that's a great explanation of the kind of omnipresent sheep element. I had kind of for a little while sort of puzzled at it and then just put it aside, but I was happy to see it on your list of topics, especially because like my first topic, just my little like cutesy name for it, I called it Slicing Up Eyeballs, which was based on the line from the Pixies song.
I want you to know.
Oh!
Yes.
Yeah, which was about the experimental film Un Chien Andalou, the Buñuel and Dali film, which opens with a sheep's eyeball being sliced open with a razor blade.
Oh yeah,
I had completely forgotten all about that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay.
That's totally out there, like very left field, but I like the little synchronicities,
Yes. Well, and there's this really odd part that I noticed as well. If you turn to, again, I'm sorry I don't have page numbers. It's when they're basically just having that giant orgy behind the counters.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the limbs sticking up.
Yeah, exactly. So you see the writing behind the bottom three panels. So I typed out everything that I could discern from that, and then I could not find a reference to this writing anywhere apart from 2 articles, both written in German. So shout out to Germany and all German comic book writers for actually noticing the little things, because they were the only 2 references I could find on anybody noting the writing behind here. But I'll just read it for you. What is visible and what I could kind of piece together is this.
And this is page 15.
Sheep come walking, knocking, talking, or toking, depending on how you read the writing, in my clocking electric dreams of TV screens, fiends of chiefs and cheese and late-night commercials that don't make sense, walking in electric dreams and robot dreams of comic book cannibal sheep/wolves, coats and wandering floors with water and silks. And that's where it kind of cuts off. I can't find the rest.
That's incredible. And it's got some
Yeah,
Philip
so I
K.
don't-
Dick in there.
Yeah,
He's
so I was
just
gonna say
pulling it all
somebody
out.
Exactly.
read
Pulling
some
it all
Philip K.
out.
Dick.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
love it.
So I don't know if this is maybe something Neil Gaiman like wrote and just threw on the background. Like, yeah, I was.
Maybe he's just
Free
getting
versa.
kind of like madly meta here. I can see the word comic books in here too. Like
Yep.
he's just really connecting, becoming this character in order to write this issue.
Yeah, I just really love that we're so saturated with this imagery that it's even in writing behind all the panels, so you can't escape it. So even then when you're not looking for it, like by the time I was like, nope, I've counted all the sheep. They're all in here. Which, counting sheep. That's another great.
Oh yeah, you try to fall asleep by counting sheep.
Right. So like I've literally counted all of the sheep. Then I laugh about the fact that I've counted sheep. I'm not looking for them anymore. I'm just reading the issue, and then I get to that page and I'm like, are you kidding me? There's a sheep I missed?
Not a bad topic, Ashley. Sean, what do you got for us next?
All right, we're gonna get real nerdy here, so get ready, folks. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the unique formal elements of this issue, like the mechanics of telling a story on a page. So, to start, give you a little bit of background. So, the fundamental mechanic of comics is the representation of time as space, right? The page is divided into sections. Sections are called panels. What the cartoonist Chris Ware has described as boxes of time. So this is because when you're telling a story in comics, an event within the narrative itself is broken up into a series of discrete moments, and each moment is represented as a still image within a panel. And then by carefully choosing which moments to draw out and what information to present, the authors create the illusion of the passage of time. So that's kind of very basic. The reader, right? The reader actively participates in this illusion in a couple ways. The first way is by agreeing to believe that any given panel the reader is looking at is the present. So for American or European readers, this panel is the present. Everything above and to the left of it is the past, which no longer exists. Everything below and to the right of it is the future, which hasn't happened yet. So even though it's there in ink on the very same page you're looking at, and your eye probably can't help but take in the whole page at once, we agree to pretend that this little box of time is the only thing happening right now. Okay, so that's one way. The other main way we participate in the illusion is by taking two separate images, two panels, and transforming them into one single idea. So this happens through what the cartoonist and comics theorist Scott McCloud calls closure, where the reader's imagination actively fills in the unseen space between panels. The gutter, it's called. And so participates in the meaning-making process in a way that no other art form can really claim. Like, I guess you do that with, like, film in a way, because it's just still images, like, projected. But it's happening so fast, you don't think of it that way, right? It's 24 frames per second, or something like that. So McCloud, in his wonderful book, Understanding Comics, so if you're curious about, how to read comics, what to get out of comics, definitely recommend that. He writes, comics panels fracture both time and space, offering a jagged, staccato rhythm of unconnected moments. But closure allows us to connect these moments and mentally construct a continuous, unified reality. So this remarkable process happens totally off the page and in the mind of the reader, which is why McCloud cleverly calls comics the invisible art, right? Because it's all happening in your mind, the actual important stuff. So that's the absolute basics. But of course, it is way more complicated than that. In fact, in comic scholarship, the space between panels, that gutter, has produced an overabundance of interpretations and theories throughout the last couple decades. It's the illusion, it's the aporia, the site of trauma, the liminal space, the capital U unconscious, the capital R real, the face of God. Okay, not the last one.
Hold up.
Yeah. But my point is, a lot, maybe too much, has been read into this little space. I don't want to go that far, But I do want to look at some of the really cool ways Gaiman, Dringenberg, and Jones use the breakdown of the page in the panels to highlight that time as space element and how it influences the reader's encounter with the book. And we know this is stuff that Neil thinks about. In Highbender's Sandman Companion, Gaiman says, "I often think of comics as songs. You're looking at the beat. And one of the things that you never get in prose, or almost never, for it's much harder to do in prose, is the rhythm of a sequence of panels." And think about it, right? So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's different than 1, 2, 3, 4, which is different than 1, 2, 3, 4, and much different than 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? The overall clock time is the same, but the pace changes our experience of the duration. So the first kind of level of impact here is the unique concept of a story that takes place in 24 hours and is told in 24 pages. So as we talked about earlier, he originally tried to start off doing it like 1 hour per page, realized he couldn't really do that. But still, largely, when you turn a page in this issue, you're on a new hour. And then you've got the inclusion of this little timer along with numerous images of clocks, watches, etc. Within the book that all serve to make us more conscious of time in this issue than we would be with most other comics. Still, this is a fairly simple conceit, and it's far more interesting to me what's being done with the pacing and the temporality within and across panels themselves. For example, see how the number of panels per page and their emphasis can affect the way we experience the story. In hour 1, the first few pages, I would say we're moving at a relaxed pace, 5 or 6 panels per page, clear actions connecting each panel, driving the easy flow of the reader's experience. Bette cuts a tuna sandwich, carries it across the diner, places it in front of Judy, fills her coffee, walks back to the counter. The flow is easy and naturalistic. But as we get to the end of hour 1, we see an entirely different type of panel transition. To use McLeod's terms, it's no longer like one action connecting another action, but one aspect connecting another aspect. We get 5 panels of John Dee, not moving at all, and a 3-panel row with an increasing emphasis on the ruby. Now we know roughly how long it takes to cut a tuna sandwich and put it on a table, but how long do we stare at Dream's ruby? How slow is the zoom, to borrow a film term? It's an entirely different sort of temporality we experience there.
You're right.
So then as we move through hours 2 through 6, and the tension increases, we move away from that 5 to 6 panel grid and towards the 9-panel grid. The rhythm of the story changes, there are more beats, and thus a kind of growing intensity. The 9-panel grid is one I always associate with paranoia and menace, since it was used so effectively in Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen just a few years before. So if you've ever read Watchmen, it's the whole book is 9 panels per page.
Yeah. Oh, I never connected it with that feeling, though. That makes total sense.
We also see some panel transitions that are fairly rare in Western comics at the time, where panels are added to create additional intervals of time. So I'm thinking of where Dee first uses the ruby. I think it's hour 2. And Mark goes from rushing to leave to ordering more coffee and thinking, great coffee. Right?
Yeah, I knew everything was wrong in that moment. And it comes right after the slow zoom, on the ruby too. That's when the issue really starts. The chaos really starts.
Yeah, and you could do that. You could show that happening in 2 or maybe even 1 panel. But here it's done over 3, with 1 completely silent panel in which nothing's happening. But its presence on the page forces us to slow down our reading, to guess at what Mark's thinking, to stew in the vague sense of unease that's growing. We see this again a couple pages later, in which the 9-panel grid allows us to experience the clear repetition of figures and poses with Gary and Kate. Mm-hmm. We know 2 hours pass based on the caption, but the repeated images contradictingly give a sense of no time passing at all.
Yeah.
It's honestly one of like the most disturbing page layouts in the whole book, really. This is like where they keep stopping and thinking like, wait, did we just and then they go back to like smiling like blithely, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, 2 more quick examples I want to call out. One is in hour 12, where Kate is telling her deeply disturbing like necrophilia story. In the 4 panels in the upper right corner of the page, the pace is determined entirely by Kate's narrative and not at all by the images in the panels. In fact, there's only one image, and that is then divided by the panel borders.
And for the readers at home, that's page 14 in the version that I'm using.
Yeah, so there's nothing happening within that image that would force our eyes to move from one panel to another. Like, it's just driven by her story. So we're seeing an entirely different use of the page breakdown here. One where moments and beats and everything I talked about earlier is, in a sense, suspended. And when something like that happens, as an active reader, you have to say, like, well, why? How does this presentation change the effect of the work? And I would say it calls attention to the pain and shame of this forced confession. So we, the reader here, are like a kind of voyeuristic intruder peeking into someone's most private moments. Kate doesn't meet our gaze, and so our eyes wander freely over her features. Even the grid itself makes it seem as though we're peeping through a window and catching her unaware. But the grid also divides her, much as she's forced to recount this shameful secret against her will. She's both telling the tale and listening to herself tell it. Performer and audience, torn apart for Dee's amusement. It's a really remarkable moment, and Dringenberg draws the hell out of it. The last example I'll include is the expert use of the splash page, a single image that fills the page with no panel divisions at all. So here it takes place in hour 22. It's one of the last couple pages of the book. And it's where Dee is like standing alone among the mutilated bodies in the diner.
And that's page 22.
That fits the hour thing.
Mm-hmm.
Since panels alongside dialogue and captions are what determines the pace of the story, the absence of those elements has the opposite effect of indicating timelessness. On the splash page, we are frozen in the moment, unmoving, a dead witness to a completed crime. The tension evaporates, and we can only gaze, frozen, upon the wreckage.
Wow.
So that's my little close reading of this issue for you.
Fantastic. I mean, it's true. These panels, just the way that they shift and the spacing in between, and it seems like each character has a moment, and each character's moment appears differently, not just in coloring and the drawing techniques, but also the panels. Very brilliantly done. Thanks for pointing all that out, Sean.
Yeah.
Ashley, do you have another deep dive?
I do, yeah. Sean, thanks for all that depth, because we're about to get real shallow.
Let's lighten it up a bit, huh?
So for my second deep dive topic, I wanted to make a quick highlight of Secret Hearts. It's the soap opera that Dee is watching on the TV right after he asks Bet to turn it on for him, or rather to make it work.
Yeah, make the TV work.
It's phrasing that, yeah, it makes me laugh every time. I wanted to highlight this because I wanted to see if there was a specific soap opera he was pulling from, only to find out, and I didn't know this ahead of time, that Secret Hearts was a DC romance comic that ran from 1949 to 1971. And so typical issues featured 3 romance stories, an advice article, some ads for Wonder Woman, no sexism there, and then some illustrated poetry, such as False Love by Sir Walter Scott. So they were really pulling, like, they weren't sure what they were doing at first, and then they kind of focused in on the sort of teen beat aspect, where there would be 3 stories or maybe 1 main story over a series of issues, and then some love advice towards the end, like, where's a great place to meet boys, or stuck between 2 beaux, here's how to choose, that kind of thing. and so you had these teenage issues that just focused on romance. So I love their feature in the comic because the sort of plot points that we're getting in each clip of the show really reflect well the types of plot points that were in the comic themselves. I also like the fact that it's happening as Judy is having her own romantic drama,
yes.
which is also very similar to the dramas found in this comic. It's just that she's a lesbian, and they wouldn't have featured any sort of queer love in Secret Hearts, being when it was happening. But there are some like really hilarious, just to lighten the mood a little bit, some really hilarious cover stories that were shared. And I just want to read the plots of these to you real quick. So from issue 11, whether he was gay, angry, tender, suspicious, romantic, she loved Paul. He brought her heartache and happiness by showing her the 5 faces of love. And that's the title of the story.
Ooh.
The 5 faces of love. And that's the synopsis.
Wow.
I feel like I only know 3, so I might need to check this out.
Another one is Linda falls in love with Rick, an irresponsible hippie. When he is arrested, or when she is arrested at the scene of one of Rick's crimes, she refuses to give him up to the police in Love Is Not a Happy Thing.
Oh.
Plus, Kelly starts to sing with her boyfriend Greg's band, but she thinks that Greg is jealous of her success in Love Song in Blue. So, a lot of these sort of romantic plot points show up in Judy's own storyline as we learn about her as a character. And I kind of love the fact that Neil Gaiman has lifted this source material and then put a fresh face on it and given it to a character that really, has some pretty tragic storylines, but allows her to have the sort of romance novel that were featured in these very dated comics. And I just really appreciate the fact that he's taken, again, a DC property and breathed new life into it. So if you go back and read, you can find them on eBay everywhere. There are a lot of comic book shops selling, original issues. You can find them. The illustrations are hilarious as well.
Goodness.
There's one.
I'm looking at some of the stuff right now, and every single cover has a woman in distress, and often in a man's arms.
I spent 2 hours just reading out covers to my husband. There's one in this issue, Distant Love, and there's this man sort of caressing a ginger debutante on the on the balcony of some big cruise ship, and then his girlfriend is in a rowboat behind this cruise ship trying to catch up with them, saying, "Oh, Danny, I should hate you for what you're doing to me, but I can't help loving you." And she's just frantically rowing, trying to catch up. There's another one where there's a woman sobbing in her bed, clearly pretending to be asleep, and her boyfriend and some other woman standing in the door of her bedroom, and he's saying, "It's about time she found out." And they're making out in her door while she's asleep.
The betrayal. And I only laugh because it's horrible. And because I do believe that we're progressing beyond this kind of stuff at this point.
Okay. What I will say in defense of romance comics is that, so we know Neil Gaiman, when he does sort of odes to comics, they're really often geared towards the work of Jack Kirby, and we've talked about his work some so far. He basically invented romance comics.
Really?
Yeah, from the quick look I did, I don't know that he worked on Secret Hearts at all, but he basically invented the genre of romance comics, and they pretty much saved the comic book industry, because after World War II, by the late 40s, all those superhero books stopped selling. Nobody cared about superhero books. And it was those romance books and those teen love books that kind of kept the industry afloat.
Interesting. I'd be curious to find out if he had a hand in Secret Hearts then, because he wasn't referenced when I was looking at contributors, but maybe he influenced their becoming a staple for DC.
Could be. If this sounds more straight romance, and his thing was more particularly teen, the teen romance book, so a little bit different, but could be.
The other really funny feature about these is so all the heroines look very, as Pat said, sad, distressed, trying to choose the right thing to do. All of the women that are depicted as being like the other women, or the friend, the betrayal of the friend trying to wedge their way into a relationship, have these like really severely penciled eyebrows that look so like you can't interpret them as anything other than evil. So there's one cover where a woman is looking into her own bedroom mirror, and in lipstick it says, "So you think he's yours, eh?" And then in the back there's this just really awful, evil looking woman shutting a door behind her as she's like following her boyfriend out. So it kind of gives me like R.L. Stein vibes as well sometimes.
Shout out R.L. Stein.
Truly. So yeah, I'd be really curious to get my hands on a few of these issues, because the ad copy for each one was so hilarious and so dramatic and so specific to the time. And to its credit, like in the 60s, there were a lot of issues that focused on like interracial coupling. Nice. And talking about trying to stay together despite how the world views them. And I thought that was a really incredible insight into how people were trying to step forward in the narratives being told. But yeah, a lot of the other gender politicking was just not quite there yet.
You know, we're still working on it to this day, I think.
You're telling me.
But I think Gaiman did a pretty good job in this issue of not necessarily, I mean, you know, as you said, everybody gets it. Everybody's a goner. Nobody's any better than each other in this issue, I think. He doesn't generally seem to have the misogyny of his predecessors baked into his writing, which is a very wonderful thing to read, even in such a gory issue of a comic book. And with that, let's head into our favorites. But first, the waiter's coming over. I need to order. Or, wait, Ashley, didn't I already order my food?
I just got my coffee, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Is something wrong?
I love this place.
You know, I love this place. This is great. I'm going to order my food.
Ben and Ava had the perfect life.
Do you want me to drive?
No, I'll be all right. I'm not due for another month.
Until they had a tragic accident. Now they're on a road trip to reconnect.
It's been 5 months.
They stop at a bed and breakfast owned by Martha and Dennis Newman.
Oh, well, hello there. Dennis, we've got guests.
Martha, where's supper?
Who have no intentions of letting them leave.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, sounds like someone fell.
Gotcha!
What do you want with us? Why are you doing this? This is about something much bigger.
It's about family.
You have to run! They're catching up!
Stay the night. 11 episodes that will keep you on the edge of your seat.
All right, on to the favorites. Ashley, what panel did you choose this week?
Ooh, this one was hard. There were so many great panels, but the one that I chose the one that kept making me giggle, because I did need some levity throughout this one.
Yeah.
It's very specifically, again, forgive me on the lack of page numbers, it's when Mark is thinking he's going to be late to his job interview, and we see Dee use the ruby for the first time. It's the red panel of him making the face, and Mark's hand is kind of cutting through the panel itself. This drawing, this rendering of Dee makes me laugh every time, because it looks like the setup to a meme. Just the facial expression he has, like he's just like, you know, as he's like coursing with this ruby power, and
so he's
just
like kind of
leaned
back and his teeth are out and he's
Right.
about to do something, but again, he's not exactly the godlike figure that he sees himself as, so he kind of just looks like a dork.
He really does. He really does. So that's the panel I chose. I thought it was really funny. I like the fact that there's this really extravagant use of color. I also kind of like that Mark's hand is punching through that panel to sort of, to me, and again, I might be reading into it, demonstrate that reality is starting to punch through Dee's vision for what he wants the world to be. So, people are coming to, they're starting to break his desires for this world, and then he reins it back in again. So just generally, I just like how this is composed and how, as Sean had mentioned, how time is being expressed here. But really specifically, just because it makes me laugh every time I look at it.
It's a fantastic little pink panel. That's on page 6 on my issue. Sean, what do you have for today's panel?
Well, I knew it was gonna be a panel with someone's tongue out, but I had trouble picking which one. See, I thought I was gonna go for the panel it's in hour 11, where Dee is being carried around on people's shoulders, and he's got God written on his chest.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the page on the far right is where he politely, but not too interestingly, sticks his tongue out to lick blood from the severed finger.
I believe
he doesn't really want to do it. He's like, I don't really want to be doing this, but this is what a god does.
I believe the internet has given us the official term of blep.
Oh yeah, that is kind of a blep, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's just so disturbing and creepy. That was really up there for me, but it's not the one I picked.
It's not the one you picked.
Okay.
Of course. The one I picked
Sean
was even...
sneak action.
Classic Sean.
The one I picked, was even more horrifying to me, and it was on the previous, the 2 pages before, and it's the one where Kate is standing in the background and Dee is in the foreground.
Yes!
And he's wandering around, kind of experiencing these dreams of happiness that people have, and their dreams of happiness are all really gross. And Kate involves, you see on the previous page, she's holding Gary's severed head on a plate, cradling it lovingly, right? With sort of like a stylized kind of Marilyn Monroe background, happy that he's no longer going to have his little indiscretions. He's all hers, right? And then we move to this panel that I'm talking about. What's that?
So you're moving back to the panel. I think that was another Sean sneak right there.
Yeah, I think it is.
I guess it sort of was, but it's just setting up my panel. But that's not in the running. It was just, but I guess it is. Okay, so moving on to my actual panel. Presuming that she is still cradling Gary's severed head, she seems to be tongue kissing the imaginary severed head in that panel that we're looking at. And the fact that you can't actually see her doing it, but you see her making the motions is so deeply disturbing. I have to give it my panel pick of this issue.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really good one.
Are we supposed to interpret the shadow behind her as Gary in his own fantasy simultaneously while Kate is in her fantasy?
I think that's a really good explanation. I did not know, honestly, but I feel like that's right, because it is sort of in the same position that he is in the convertible on the previous page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know it's my turn. So I was gonna say the one where John D is licking the finger, but you already took that one from me. And then my backup.
So this is the unfair part of the Sean sneak.
And then my backup was gonna be the Kate holding the severed head with Madonna behind her. So I got Sean sneaked twice.
Oh my gosh! Welcome to being a co-host, Pat.
And so it'd be really easy for me to love the nails in the hand. I like the gory stuff, and I just love that they were able to do this. But I think that my third backup was the pack leader.
Wait, I got one more first.
So this is page 20. The pack leader's teeth are strong and sharp. He is a good leader. The challenge has been met. And Gary is, it looks like he's ripping this, the flesh of somebody's neck out with his teeth.
Yeah, poor Mark.
Yeah, Mark. In some of the other panels where there's blood, he's covered in red. But this one, on page 20, everything has gone completely psychedelic in the color choices. And he is neon yellow with some green in the background as just this horrifying orange. And you can almost see, if you look up in the right-hand corner, the face of a wolf.
Yeah.
Just kind of back there. Not even really ferocious looking, almost sad while he does this. It's beautiful. And it says, roar, roar, roar. Because as we all know, that's the sound of the beast. I love it.
It is a
Beautiful.
very cool effect.
It's beautiful. And the splatter on his suit. Oh, man. It's beautiful. I love the gore. What can I say? My closest connection to Sandman is the horror comics. I would borrow my mom's Tales from the Crypt, etc. And this was before I was probably old enough to be allowed to do that.
Is that what made it stealing?
And that's what made it stealing. Because she was, as Ben said before, my mom was always, you can borrow comics, just put them back in the sleeve when you're done. So, we'll bounce back over to Sean now. Who is your favorite non-Morpheus character? Not that we really got much Morpheus in this issue.
No, this is a tough one because nobody comes out looking too great, and I feel like I'm afraid I'm gonna take at least one of yours here. But
you're allowed 2 sneaks only.
No, I'm just taking one this time. For a favorite character, I only do one. But I think I gotta go Judy on this one.
Cool.
Because I feel like Dringenberg enjoyed drawing her more than the other characters. Gave a lot of emotions to those images. I really think, it's fairly simple line work he's doing, but I think the expressions he draws on Judy in particular are extremely communicative. I'm thinking especially of the panel with her talking to Donna's mother on the phone, and how her hand is in her hair. You feel like she's just sort of clenching her head, and these tears of frustration are falling down her face because she's you don't have to approve of me, Mrs. Kavanaugh, but I just want to. It's you can really feel how angry and painful it is, where she's just trying to find her girlfriend who she had a fight with, and now she's got to defend her existence to this prejudiced old woman. That just rage and frustration comes across so well. So I got to give it to Judy for mine.
Certainly. What about you, Ashley?
You have so many to choose from, and I kept ping-ponging all over the place, but where I ended up was, again, to give myself a little bit of levity, I'm going to have to go with the amazing Herschel.
Nice.
Yeah, that was so weird.
I wasn't sure if he and Betty, his wife, ever came up in other comics. I never quite found him featured anywhere else, but I find the little panel where he's explaining that it must be the rays, and he's got a little finger pointed, and he's so serious.
We're thinking it's probably rays.
Yeah. It's just with the chaos of everything else going on, how plain-faced he is and relaxed and matter-of-fact he is about everything just makes me laugh every time. I just love that he's featured. And that we get these other superheroes that maybe we wouldn't imagine being particularly heroic, but I feel like it just fits considering he's the local superhero team, he and his wife. It's a very small time.
Yeah, just like your friendly block. Not even the whole neighborhood, just the block. I'm going to go with Bet because I can totally relate. I observe people. I write about other people's stories. I retell the endings and the beginnings of people's stories. And I have no problem morally doing that. I don't feel that it's wrong to steal other people's life stories and moments and make them into artwork and then turn around and share them with the world. Although I can see where the argument could be made that they're not my stories to tell, and especially to retell and to change. But that's all just a setup for what John Dee ends up doing to all these people. So she's kind of like which I didn't even realize until we started talking about this issue with the two of you, that she's basically a metaphor for what he's about to do. And then in general, Neil Gaiman, he's written himself into this issue as her and as John Dee, as the storyteller. And I'm not Sean sneaking in John Dee here, although he was clearly just fantastic in this issue. I've also worked a lot of service industry jobs, and something that I do to keep my creativity occupied and my mind occupied while I'm working at a bar or a restaurant has been to observe the people that I'm waiting on and write about them. So I immediately clicked with her. I think that the best part of her character for me personally is that she truly thinks that one day she will write the novel, whereas I write albums and I publish them. And I know so many people in the service industry who will never write that record or finish that song or even save the pieces of paper. They'll just drink their shift drinks at the end of the shift, go home, wake up, and come back to work. And it's really a really sad thing because they are often brilliant minds that could contribute amazing stories if they didn't have to work their entire life away, especially at such an energy-draining job.
You should do a TED Talk.
I'll just keep writing rap albums. see if they offer me a platform one day.
She really is, though, emblematic of that. I've heard that advice over and over and over again. Like, no, you don't want to or aspire to be a writer. You are a writer. Put that in your Twitter bio. Even if you only write one sentence in a Word document, you are a writer.
You are
a writer. I feel like she read that and she was like, "You're right." And then just now she's like, "Yeah, I'm a waitress." Wink.
It's so funny. She's like, we're in on her little secret that she's not actually just a waiter. And it's like the only part that's devastating. At first I was like, oh, this is cute. She likes writing little stories for herself. But it's devastating because she truly thinks that one day she will publish a novel, which is not the case. So it goes from being like cute and endearing to devastating, and then everybody dies. Spoiler! What a great talk. Sean filled us in about the changes in this issue from what we've read so far, with Neil Gaiman breaking all the rules and pushing his readers' limits as well. Maybe losing a few readers along the way. Definitely would have gained my undying allegiance to this comic if this was being published while I was reading, because just, oh my goodness, the gore. Ashley pointed out the omnipresent imagery of sheep, which, I didn't even notice during my read-through. She connected the sheep-like behavior of the victims of John Dee and him being the false prophet to imagery of sheep that we've seen in classic literature and religion throughout the ages. Next, Sean broke down the fundamental mechanics of comic books for us once again, and the reader's participation in the process, especially in the gutter, in order to discuss how Gaiman and his team masterfully use the panel positioning to pace this chaotic, disturbing story that touches on many different characters and their micro stories. Ashley, thank you so much for putting us on to the dramatic, dated, kind of misogynist romance comics, Secret Hearts. Maybe we'll get a Netflix adaptation of that one day soon. Who knows? I'm just putting it out there because it's definitely what we need, right?
I think I unironically agree there.
Yeah, I mean, they could do it. They could do it, I believe. Your favorite panels are always illuminating, even though I've seen the panels. Hearing you focus in on them makes me understand what's going on the page a little bit more. And even if Sean totally snuck my first two choices into his,
I'm so sorry.
I'm into it. I'm still about it. There's a lot of characters to choose from this issue. We all did our best to choose one. I'm sure that this has replay value, and that next time we'll all focus on somebody else, like perhaps the Dino Puppet, which was going to be my fallback if somebody chose Bet. And that's a Sean Sneak from producer Pat filling in for co-host Ben.
Nice.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sandman Unlocked.
And remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sandman Unlocked, an Odd Conduit Media production. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sandman Unlocked. Join us on Discord as well. Thanks to our show producer, Patrick Childers, and to Lieutenant Headtrip for our theme and incidental music. If you'd like to support us directly, head over to our Patreon. You can follow Ashley on Twitter at DEEDEE_K and on Instagram and TikTok at Ashley Mowers. Find Sean on Twitter at Lon Dogson and find Headtrip everywhere at LT Headtrip. You can get all of this info and more in the show notes. Make sure to follow and subscribe and review us wherever you listen. Until next time, and remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.
Odd Conduit Media.